Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The Riverwood Plantation stood like a white sentinel amidst the Spanish moss and ancient oaks of Chatham County, Georgia. In the summer of 1852, this property, located approximately 16 miles from Savannah's bustling harbor, became the center of an investigation that would be deliberately obscured from public record for over a century. According to documents uncovered during courthouse renovations in 1963, what transpired at Riverwood defied the established social order of antebellum Georgia in ways that many found too disturbing to acknowledge. The plantation belonged to the Hargrove family, who had amassed considerable wealth through cotton, indigo, and the domestic slave trade. Thomas Hargrove, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 children occupied the main house, a grand structure with 14 rooms and the distinctive columned facade typical of wealthy southern estates. What distinguished Riverwood, however, was not its architectural splendor, but rather what lay beneath it. A journal recovered from the Savannah Historical Society archives, purportedly written by a county physician named Dr. James Whitaker, contains the first recorded account of the events. The journal entry, dated August 2nd, 1852, notes, "Called to Riverwood upon urgent request from neighboring plantation. No response at main house. Unusual silence prevails. House appears abandoned despite no prior notice of travel." The peculiar aspect of this case begins with the fact that no one reported the Hargrove family missing for nearly 3 weeks. According to tax records and business ledgers preserved in the county archive, Thomas Hargrove was known for his punctuality and business acumen. His sudden disappearance from a scheduled auction in Savannah on July 14th initially raised no alarms. Summer fevers were common, and temporary absences were often attributed to illness. What followed would be documented only in fragments, pieces of evidence carefully collected but deliberately filed away in records marked administrative irregularities, a euphemism used by county officials for cases deemed too sensitive for public knowledge. According to testimony collected from neighboring plantation owners, Riverwood maintained a population of approximately 47 enslaved individuals. Among them was a man recorded only as Solomon, described in property ledgers as approximately 30 years of age, literate, trained in carpentry and metalwork, purchased from Charleston, 1848. Solomon's name appears repeatedly in what remains of the subsequent investigation. The account of what actually occurred at Riverwood must be pieced together from multiple sources. The most comprehensive narrative comes from a deposition given by William Parker, overseer at the neighboring Magnolia Creek Plantation, recorded by County Sheriff Thomas Blackwood on August 9, 1852. Parker stated that after several days without communication from Riverwood, he dispatched 2 of his men to inquire about delayed shipments. They returned describing the plantation as eerily quiet, with no visible activity in the fields or quarters. Parker himself rode to investigate the following day. What he found, according to his sworn statement, was a plantation in perfect order, but entirely devoid of the Hargrove family. The enslaved workers continued their duties in the fields and house, but claimed no knowledge of the family's whereabouts. When questioned about the master's absence, they reportedly directed all inquiries to Solomon, who had apparently assumed management of daily operations. Parker described his interaction with Solomon as unsettling in its propriety. Solomon, dressed in clothing normally reserved for house servants rather than field workers, spoke with unusual directness, explaining that Master Hargrove had departed on business and left him responsible for maintaining order. What raised Parker's suspicions was not merely the unprecedented nature of such an arrangement, but rather the behavior of the other enslaved individuals, who moved about their tasks with what he described as an unnatural quietude their eyes downcast when speaking of the family, as though concealing something through their silence. The investigation might have stalled there, a curious situation, but perhaps explicable by unusual but not impossible circumstances, had it not been for the arrival of Thomas Hargrove's brother, Colonel James Hargrove, from Charleston 3 days later. He produced a document, later determined to be forged, bearing what appeared to be Thomas Hargrove's signature, authorizing this arrangement. His unexpected appearance at Riverwood set in motion the discovery that would shock even the most hardened local officials. Colonel Hargrove, according to Sheriff Blackwood's report, was immediately suspicious of the circumstances. Unlike Parker, he had authority to demand a complete search of the property. What they discovered beneath the main house would be documented only in the most clinical terms in official records, though private correspondence would later reveal the profound disturbance it caused among those present. The Riverwood mansion, like many substantial homes in the region, was built elevated on brick pillars to protect against seasonal flooding and provide air circulation in the sweltering Georgian summers. The space beneath, typically used for storage, had been modified. Behind a recently constructed brick wall, accessible only through a narrow passage disguised as a root cellar, investigators discovered what Sheriff Blackwood's report tersely described as improvised detention structures. A letter from Colonel Hargrove to his wife, preserved in the family collection donated to the Savannah Historical Society in 1951, provides more explicit detail. What we found beneath James's home defies comprehension. Iron cages, constructed with considerable skill, contained what remained of my brother and his family. Evidence suggests they survived for some duration in these conditions. The craftsmanship of their prison indicates deliberate, methodical construction over time. The implications are too horrific to commit fully to paper. The medical examiner's report, sealed until 1968, confirmed that Thomas Hargrove, his wife Eleanor, their 16-year-old son Thomas Jr., and daughters Catherine, aged 14, and Mary, aged 11, had all been kept alive in these conditions for approximately 2 weeks before succumbing to dehydration. The report noted evidence of minimal sustenance provided during their captivity. What distinguishes this case from other violent incidents of the period was the extraordinary inversion of power it represented. Solomon, property ledgers revealed, had been purchased specifically for his metalworking skills. Testimony from other enslaved workers, though initially reluctant, eventually revealed that Solomon had spent months secretly creating the components of the cages in the plantation's blacksmith shop, ostensibly making repairs to farm equipment. The construction beneath the house occurred gradually during nighttime hours. More disturbing was the revelation that many of the other enslaved individuals had knowledge of Solomon's plans. Some participated willingly, others were coerced through threats against family members. The collective silence maintained during and after the family's captivity suggests a complex web of complicity, fear, and perhaps satisfaction at the reversal of circumstances. Solomon's personal history, pieced together from bills of sale and rare first-hand accounts, indicates he had been separated from his wife and children when sold to Hargrove. According to testimony from other enslaved workers, he was subjected to particularly harsh treatment at Riverwood, including regular whippings for infractions as minor as excessive contemplation or inappropriate expression, terms noted in Thomas Hargrove's disciplinary ledger. The psychological dimensions of the case were perhaps most clearly articulated in the journal of Reverend Samuel Whitfield, who visited Riverwood after the discovery. He wrote, "What occurred here represents not merely an act of violence, but a methodical reconstruction of the very power structure these people inhabited. The family was not simply killed, but made to experience prolonged confinement and helplessness, the very conditions they had imposed upon others. The calculated nature of this reversal suggests a mind focused on more than mere revenge. Court records indicate that 23 of Riverwood's enslaved population were ultimately implicated in the conspiracy. Solomon and 6 others identified as primary collaborators were publicly executed on September 6, 1852. The others received various punishments. What's notably absent from official records is any transcript of Solomon's testimony or final words. According to a newspaper clipping preserved in the Savannah Historical Society archives, he maintained an unnerving silence throughout the proceedings. The Riverwood case created significant anxiety among plantation owners throughout the coastal South. Private correspondence between wealthy families reveals a sudden preoccupation with security measures and increased scrutiny of skilled enslaved workers. A letter from plantation owner William Crawford to his brother in Virginia notes, "The Riverwood incident, while not publicly discussed, has cast a shadow over our community. One cannot help but wonder what thoughts move behind the eyes of those we believe we know." The Hargrove family's remains were interred in a private ceremony at Savannah's Bonaventure Cemetery. The original headstones, according to cemetery records, made no mention of the circumstances of their deaths, stating only that they departed this life July 1852. The plantation itself was sold the following year, the new owners demolishing the original house and rebuilding on a different portion of the property. Perhaps most telling about the impact of these events is how thoroughly they were suppressed from public memory. No newspaper accounts explicitly detailed what occurred at Riverwood. Official records were deliberately obscured. The case appears in no known history of Chatham County published before 1970. This institutional silence speaks to the profound threat that Solomon's actions represented, not just a physical danger, but an ideological one that challenged the foundational narratives of Southern society. A further disturbing epilogue emerged in 1966, when excavation for a housing development near the original Riverwood site uncovered a tin box containing what appeared to be Solomon's personal writings. These papers, now held in the Georgia State Archives restricted collection, reveal that his plan extended beyond the Hargrove family. Diagrams and lists suggest an intended region-wide uprising, with the Riverwood incident designed as merely the initial phase. Names of collaborators on neighboring plantations appear alongside detailed schedules and maps. The discovery of these documents prompted a brief, unpublicized investigation by local authorities, who determined that many of the individuals named had been sold to destinations across the South following the Riverwood incident, their connections and potential plans fragmented by their dispersal. The investigation was officially closed in February 1967, the report sealed for 50 years. In the winter of 1968, Dr. Margaret Carver, a historian researching antebellum resistance movements, petitioned for access to the Riverwood records. Her subsequent article, published in an obscure academic journal, noted an unsettling detail from Solomon's writings. Specific measurements of the cages indicated they were precisely sized to allow the captives to neither stand fully upright nor lie completely flat. Dimensions that mirrored the conditions of the vessels used in the Middle Passage that brought enslaved Africans to America. Dr. Carver's research was discontinued after she reportedly received numerous threatening letters. Her office at Emerson College was vandalized in March 1969, with specific notes from her Riverwood research destroyed. She subsequently accepted a position at a university in Canada and did not publish on the subject again. The land where Riverwood Plantation once stood has changed hands numerous times over the intervening years. By 1968, it had been subdivided for residential development. Construction workers reported numerous instances of equipment failure and unexplained accidents, particularly in the vicinity of where the original house stood. The development company eventually abandoned the project, citing soil instability concerns. Today, a portion of the former Riverwood property remains undeveloped woodland, Local residents report avoiding the area, particularly after dusk. Some attribute this aversion to knowledge of the land's history. Others simply describe an instinctive sense of discomfort. A small historical marker, erected in 2002, makes brief reference to the plantation that once occupied the site, but mentions nothing of Solomon or the events of 1852. The last known document relating directly to the case is a letter written in 1958 by Mary Collins, identified as the granddaughter of an enslaved woman who had been present at Riverwood. The letter, addressed to the Savannah Historical Society, but apparently never delivered, was found among Collins' possessions after her death in 1964. In it, she recounts a story told by her grandmother about the night the Hargrove family disappeared. She said they took them in their sleep, moving through the house like shadows. Solomon had crafted special locks that made no sound when turned. The family made no cry that anyone heard. Grandmother said the most terrible thing was the silence, how everyone continued working the next day, as though nothing had changed, stepping carefully over the cellar door beneath which the master and his family remained alive, listening to the footsteps above them, experiencing for themselves what it meant to be property rather than persons. What makes the Riverwood case particularly disturbing is not merely the gruesome fate of the Hargrove family, but the methodical role reversal it represented. Solomon did not simply kill his oppressors, he systematically subjected them to a mirror experience of the institution they had perpetuated. The calculated nature of this psychological inversion, making the powerful experience powerlessness, reveals a form of terror that transcends simple violence, forcing us to confront the darkest capabilities of the human mind when pushed beyond endurance. The Riverwood incident remains largely unknown in mainstream historical accounts. Those few academic works that reference it often do so only in passing, focusing on its implications for plantation security measures rather than examining the complex psychological and social dimensions it represents. This silence itself constitutes a final chapter in the story, the deliberate forgetting of an event too disturbing to incorporate into our understanding of the past. And yet, in certain academic circles and oral histories passed down through generations of local families, the story of Solomon and the iron cages beneath Riverwood Plantation endures, a whispered reminder that beneath the polished narratives of history lie darker truths about power, vengeance, and the depths of human capacity for calculated retribution. For those who know where to look in Bonaventure Cemetery, the Hargrove family plot contains a curious feature. Though the original headstones were replaced in the early 1900s with more elaborate markers, a small, unmarked iron post stands at the edge of the family plot. Local tradition suggests it appeared sometime in the 1870s, its origin unknown. Cemetery records make no mention of its installation or purpose. Some speculate it serves as an unacknowledged marker for Solomon himself, though his executed body was officially disposed of in an unmarked grave. Others suggest it represents something more abstract, a silent testament to histories deliberately untold, to power dynamics momentarily but significantly reversed, to terrors carefully erased from public memory but never truly forgotten. As we conclude this dark chapter of hidden history, we're left with more questions than answers. The incomplete records and institutional silence surrounding the events at Riverwood Plantation suggest a collective decision to obscure not just what happened, but what it meant. In the gaps of this historical record, we perhaps find the most disturbing element of all, the recognition that some truths are deemed too threatening to preserve, even as their echoes continue to resonate through time. The psychological complexity of the Riverwood case extends beyond the immediate horror of the Hargrove family's fate. According to a series of letters discovered in 1961 during the renovation of a former slave quarter converted to a storage building, at least 3 enslaved individuals attempted to free the family during their captivity. These letters, written by a woman identified only as Rebecca to her son, who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama, suggest that not all at Riverwood supported Solomon's actions. She wrote, "Some believe this reversal of fortune represents justice, while others see only a new form of the same evil. I cannot sleep for the sounds that come from beneath the house, yet I am forbidden to intervene." This internal conflict among the enslaved community at Riverwood adds another layer to the case, suggesting that even among those who had suffered under the Hargroves' ownership, there existed moral complexity and divided loyalties. Rebecca's letters indicate she eventually provided water to the imprisoned family on at least 2 occasions, actions that placed her at considerable risk. The final letter in the collection, dated July 27, 1852, abruptly ends mid-sentence. No record of Rebecca's fate exists in the subsequent investigation documents, though her name does not appear among those executed or punished. Sheriff Blackwood's private journal, donated to the Chatham County Historical Society by his granddaughter in 1954, reveals the profound effect the investigation had on him personally. An entry dated August 20th reads, "I have served this county for 17 years and witnessed mankind's capacity for violence in its many forms. Yet what I encountered at Riverwood has altered something fundamental in my understanding. The methodical nature of the act, not born of sudden passion but developed through months of careful planning, suggests a kind of terrible rationality. I find myself unable to view the plantations I pass without wondering what thoughts move behind the expressions of those working the fields." Blackwood resigned his position 3 months after the Riverwood incident and relocated his family to Tennessee. His subsequent correspondence makes no specific mention of the case, though his daughter's memoirs note that he never again spoke of his time in law enforcement without a shadow crossing his features. The psychological impact extended to the broader community as well. Church attendance records from St. John's Episcopal in Savannah show a marked increase in the months following the Riverwood incident. Reverend William Baldwin's sermons from this period, preserved in church archives, contain repeated references to divine order and the importance of maintaining proper relations between all classes of men as ordained by providence. Thinly veiled reassurances to a community whose foundational social structures had been profoundly challenged. Perhaps most telling was the rapid dismantling of Riverwood itself. According to county records, Colonel James Hargrove arranged for the sale of all enslaved individuals from the plantation within 6 weeks of the discovery, dispersing them across 5 states. The property itself was sold to James Mercer, a merchant from Savannah with no previous agricultural holdings, at a price significantly below market value. Mercer's correspondence with the architectural firm commissioned to design a new main house explicitly required that no part of the original structure's foundation be incorporated into the new building, and construction should occur at a remove of at least 100 yards from the previous site. The compulsion to physically erase all evidence of what occurred at Riverwood speaks to the profound psychological disturbance it represented. Unlike other violent incidents of the period, which could be categorized as rebellion or insurrection, Solomon's actions represented something more psychologically complex, a calculated restructuring of power relationships that forced the oppressors to physically experience the condition of the oppressed. A dissertation submitted to Emory University in 1965 by doctoral candidate Robert Freeman, titled "Psychological Warfare in Slave Resistance," identifies the Riverwood incident as a unique form of resistance specifically designed to inflict psychological rather than merely physical trauma. Freeman writes, "What distinguished Solomon's approach was its deliberate mirroring of the institution itself, creating a system where the Hargrove family experienced not just captivity, but the specific psychological condition of being treated as property rather than persons. The iron cages were constructed not merely to contain, but to communicate. Freeman's research includes interviews with descendants of families who owned neighboring plantations, several of whom had preserved oral histories of the incident. One account described how plantation owners within a 50-mile radius began sleeping with loaded firearms beside their beds for years afterward. Another noted that her great-grandfather had all spaces beneath his home filled with brick and mortar within a month of the Riverwood discovery. The architectural changes that swept through plantation homes in Chatham and surrounding counties in the 1850s, many of which involved eliminating or restricting access to basement and cellar spaces, may represent the most tangible legacy of Solomon's actions. These modifications, often explained in contemporary documents as improvements for ventilation or prevention of moisture damage, appear with statistically significant frequency in the years immediately following 1852. In 1854, the Georgia state legislature passed what became known as the Artisan Restriction Act, limiting the types of skills that could be taught to enslaved individuals and specifically prohibiting training in metalwork without special licensure. While the law made no direct reference to the Riverwood incident, legislative records contain committee discussions that clearly allude to it, with one senator noting the recent demonstration of how certain mechanical skills might be turned toward disturbing ends. Despite efforts to suppress knowledge of the incident, fragments persisted in cultural memory. A folk song collected by musicologist Alan Lomax during field recordings in coastal Georgia in 1934 contains verses that scholars have connected to the Riverwood case. Iron man made iron rooms, down below where no one sees. Master's house became master's tomb, tables turned on bended knees. The elderly singer, identified in Lomax's notes as William Johnson, claimed to have learned the song from his grandfather, who reportedly witnessed the public execution of Solomon and his co-conspirators. The execution itself represents another disturbing chapter in this history. According to the official report, Solomon and 6 others were hanged publicly on September 6, 1852, in a field just outside Savannah. What official documents don't record, but what emerges from private correspondence and later oral histories, is that the execution was attended by enslaved individuals forcibly brought from plantations throughout the county, a calculated demonstration of consequences. A letter from plantation owner Frederick Dalton to his brother describes the scene. They brought nearly 300 Negroes to witness the event. The condemned were permitted no final words. What struck me most profoundly was not the act itself, but the expression of the man identified as the architect of the horror. Even at the moment of death, his gaze remained level, his eyes moving deliberately across the crowd as though committing each face to memory. I confess it caused me to look away first. This description of Solomon's final moments echoes through several accounts and suggests that even in death, he maintained the psychological advantage, refusing the expected posture of submission and instead projecting a disturbing agency that continued to unsettle those present. The Riverwood case raises profound questions about the nature of terror as a response to systemic violence. Solomon's actions cannot be categorized simply as revenge, for revenge typically seeks equivalent harm. What occurred at Riverwood was instead a carefully constructed inversion, a theatrical restructuring of power relationships designed not merely to kill, but to communicate through experienced suffering. This communicative aspect emerges most clearly in one of the most disturbing details from the medical examiner's report. The document notes that small openings had been incorporated into the design of the cages, apparently to allow those imprisoned to observe the normal functioning of the plantation, continuing without them. Several witnesses reported that Solomon would occasionally bring ledgers and accounting books to these openings, asking Thomas Hargrove for instruction on plantation management matters, a grotesque parody of their former relationship. In 1959, construction workers excavating for a gas line near the former Riverwood property uncovered a metal box containing personal items believed to have belonged to Solomon. Among these was a small, handcrafted book, its pages made from scraps of different papers bound together with thread. Inside were detailed diagrams of mechanical devices, mathematical calculations, and a series of writings in a cipher that has never been fully decoded. The few fragments that scholars have translated suggest a deeply philosophical dimension to Solomon's thinking, with one passage reading, "Freedom exists first in the mind. The body may be chained while the mind creates new worlds and possibilities." This artifact suggests that Solomon possessed not just technical skill, but a complex intellectual and philosophical framework that informed his actions. The sophistication of his thinking contrasts sharply with the period's prevailing characterizations of enslaved individuals as intellectually limited, a prejudice that may have enabled him to develop his plans undetected, as his capabilities would have been systematically underestimated. The Riverwood incident occurred at a particular historical inflection point. The early 1850s saw increasing tensions around slavery, with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 intensifying Northern abolitionist sentiment while hardening Southern resolve to maintain the institution. Solomon's actions, while locally suppressed, inevitably filtered into national consciousness through private correspondence and word of mouth. References to an unnamed Georgia incident appear in several abolitionist publications of the period, though always in veiled terms. Frederick Douglass, in an 1854 speech in Rochester, made what some scholars believe was an oblique reference to Riverwood when he stated, "There comes a moment when the oppressed may devise means to communicate the true nature of their condition to those who impose it through methods that cannot be ignored or misunderstood." The specific wording, particularly the emphasis on communication rather than merely resistance, suggests knowledge of Solomon's particular approach. The deliberate erasure of the Riverwood incident from official historical narratives reflects more than just the suppression of a single, disturbing event. It represents a broader pattern of historical amnesia regarding the psychological complexities of resistance to slavery, particularly those forms that directly challenge the moral and intellectual frameworks used to justify the institution. In 1969, during preparations for a highway expansion near the original Riverwood site, workers uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 7 individuals. Archaeological examination determined these were the bodies of Solomon and the others executed for the Riverwood incident, rather than being buried in the officially designated location for executed criminals. They had been interred secretly on what was once the Plantation property. Forensic analysis revealed that at least 3 of the bodies showed signs of post-mortem mutilation. This discovery prompted a brief renewed interest in the case among civil rights activists and historians, though mainstream publications remained largely silent. The remains were eventually reinterred in an unmarked location in Bonaventure Cemetery, the ceremony attended by a small group of historians and descendants of formerly enslaved families from the region. One attendee, Eliza Johnson, then 87 years old, claimed her grandmother had been a house servant at Riverwood who escaped punishment due to her youth. According to Johnson, the story had been passed down through generations with an admonition: "Remember Solomon, not for what he did, but for what was done to make a craftsman into a monster." This generational perspective highlights perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Riverwood case, its illustration of how systems of oppression may create the very horrors they most fear. Solomon's transformation from skilled craftsman to architect of psychological torture did not occur in isolation, but rather through years of experienced trauma, humiliation, and the severing of human bonds through the sale of his family. The last significant research on the Riverwood case was conducted in 1968 by historian Dr. Thomas Mitchell, whose unpublished manuscript, Excavating Silence, Suppressed Narratives of Slave Resistance, contains the most comprehensive analysis of the available evidence. Mitchell's work remains unpublished due to his sudden death in an automobile accident in early 1969, just weeks after he reported receiving threatening letters regarding his research. Mitchell's papers, now held in the special collections of Howard University, include correspondence with several elderly residents of Chatham County who claimed familial connections to those present at Riverwood. One letter, from a woman identified only as MJ, states, "My great-grandmother was a house servant there. She told my grandmother, who told my mother, who told me, that in the weeks before it happened, Solomon spoke to no one. He worked in silence, ate in silence, moved through the plantation like a ghost. She said the others feared him and obeyed him because his eyes held something they recognized, not madness, but a clarity too terrible to name." This description of Solomon's psychological state in the period leading up to his actions suggests not an eruption of uncontrolled rage, but rather a coldly rational response to an irrational system, a deliberate deployment of terror as communication when all other forms of expression had been systematically denied. As we conclude this excavation of a deliberately buried history, we are left with unsettling questions about the nature of violence, resistance, and the human capacity for methodical cruelty. The Riverwood incident cannot be comfortably categorized as either justice or atrocity. It exists in a moral twilight zone that challenges simplistic historical narratives. What seems most certain is that the deliberate suppression of this history reflects not just the protection of a particular family's reputation, but a broader societal reluctance to confront the psychological complexities of America's foundational trauma. In the iron cages beneath Riverwood Plantation lies a metaphor for histories too disturbing to acknowledge. Contained, buried, but never truly gone. Today, no visible trace remains of Riverwood Plantation. The land has been partially developed, with suburban homes occupying former cotton fields. No historical marker acknowledges the specific events that occurred there in the summer of 1852. Yet, something of that history persists. In academic archives, in family stories passed through generations, in the conspicuous absences within official historical narratives. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Solomon's actions is not the physical suffering he inflicted, but the psychological mirror he constructed, forcing those who had denied his humanity to experience a taste of that same denial. In doing so, he created not just a historical incident, but a disturbing parable about power, oppression, and the terrible ingenuity that can emerge when human beings are pushed beyond endurance. As one local historian noted in a small community publication in 1972, what happened at Riverwood was buried twice, once beneath the house, and again beneath layers of historical silence. Yet both burials failed. Some truths refuse to remain entombed, no matter how deeply we try to enter them. The sound of footsteps above the cellar. The knowledge that those who walk freely are unaware of your existence as a person rather than property. The slow psychological collapse as one realizes that social position and power are constructs that can be reversed. These were the lessons Solomon designed into his terrible creation. Lessons that continue to disturb us not for their uniqueness, but for the way they inverted and exposed the everyday horrors of the system they emerged from. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of the Riverwood case may be not its exceptional nature, but rather how it illuminates the psychological architecture of slavery itself, a system predicated on precisely the kind of dehumanization that Solomon turned back upon its perpetrators. What happened beneath Riverwood Plantation in 1852 was not an aberration from history, but rather a dark reflection of it. A mirror held up to show the face of an institution whose true visage few were willing to acknowledge. And perhaps that is why the story remains largely untold in mainstream histories, confined to academic footnotes and local whispers. Some mirrors reflect truths too disturbing to face, truths that continue to haunt us not from the distant past, but from the ongoing echoes of that past in our present.